Hello everyone and welcome back to the NPC Dungeon. Today we're talking about new DMs, more specifically mistakes that new DMs might make. I want to be clear, not every newer DM is going to make these mistakes, and you don't have to be a new DM to make them. Also, I'm not saying these things to call out any new DMs, make them quit running games, and this is not a rant or a tirade or a criticism. This is just an attempt to share some of what I have seen in order to help us all improve. So let's learn something and move on with our first point. The first one that I'm going to be talking about is taking away player agency. In this vein, I mean stuff like rolling checks for the players, forcing things to happen, and making encounters go certain ways. Some DMs will block off entire sections of the story, throw up walls when the players do something that they didn't expect, and even dictate their actions for them. I'm sure you've all played in games like that, and it's not fun. Honestly, it's kind of toxic, and obviously you don't have to be a new DM to do this. But if you are, it's just a little bit more excusable. Some people might do this simply because they want control over the story, or they have this delusion that they're the sole creator of the story, but that's a mistaken viewpoint. As I've said many times before on this channel, the story is something that the entire group is doing together. But if you have a DM who is doing this and is pretty new, chances are they're doing this simply because they haven't developed the instincts and planning skills necessary to adapt to the unexpected. And to remedy this, firstly, I want to say that this game is collaborative, and it'll probably be more fun if everyone is getting the story, and if everyone's suggestions and ideas are heard out. I can guarantee you, if you let your players' random crazy ideas happen, you'll probably run into situations that can be even better, probably will be even better, than what you had planned on your own. And as DMs, we have to be okay with that. And be ready for this. I recommend planning for it. I have a few episodes all about this already, and I'll include those in the description if you're interested. But for now, the basics are that the more you plan for, the more ready you'll be. Think of the stuff going on in the world as its own entity, and think about how that entity would react if your players do this or that. Your players are going to do things that you won't expect, but the more you plan for, the more you can repurpose for and adapt to whatever they might do. That sounds like a lot of work, and well, I'll be honest with you, it is, but honestly, it's one of my favorite parts. What I do is I like to plan for adventures and arcs like I would a mystery. What I mean by this is that in a good mystery, you will make whatever crime that happened happen and leave the clues about it as a result of that, not for their own sake. They exist because of what's going on in the background. In the same way, everything that exists in the story exists because of what's happening in the story, not for its own sake. So if your players are going into a dark forest, hunt down an evil cult, the cult is there because the plot demands it, obviously, but think, why are they there specifically? Is there some ancient dead monster in the forest? Are they trying to summon and revive? What are they doing there? Summoning the monster? How? What about the ancient rite? What are they doing? Are there storehouses scattered through the forest with supplies they need? And why are they summoning it? All of these things can help you build up an arsenal for how you might respond when your players do something unexpected. Do your players golf check? Fine. Maybe they run into one of the storehouses. Did they decide to research before they go? Great. Maybe they learn about the old monster. And by the way, before I move on to my next point, I want to make one final note. Allowing them to discover stuff like this is great practice. If your players do something really creative or smart in research or something like I mentioned a second ago in my example that I just gave, you want to reward them so they keep doing that. This is why having all these backup plans, one of the many reasons why having all these backup plans is so handy. It helps you intentionally reward these kinds of behaviors instead of just haphazardly reacting. And this last little note is actually related to my next point, and it's a big one. Do not use the game to get back at certain players, and do not target specific players. It's immature and never has the intended effect. I also talk about this at length in my episode dealing with 3 types of troublesome players, and I'll link that one in the description if you want to hear more about it from that end of things. But for today, I honestly get why new DMs might fall into this. Just think about it. There's so much bad advice out there about this. There are jokes all over the internet all about rolling damage to your players when they, for example, use a spell in an unexpected or creative way. Go and look up D&D memes or DM memes, and I'm sure you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. In fact, if you're new to it, you'd be forgiven for thinking this is the norm and that it's okay, but it is neither of those things. It is an unhealthy thing for DMs to do, and it just creates a toxic environment. All it does is anger the player and cause more problems. Besides, you're not telling them what they're doing. How can you expect them to remedy this if they don't even know what they're doing? And how can you remedy this? Easy. Tell them. Communicate with them. After the session, let them know what's causing you problems in a calm manner and away from everybody else. Unless, of course, they're specifically making inappropriate comments, causing a toxic environment, or just making the other players feel uncomfortable. In cases like this, it's best to handle that over the table. Tell them to stop over the table and back up other players so they know you have their backs. And that actually leads me to another important point about DMs that doesn't directly involve DMing. This seemingly contradictory mystery point is all about your other responsibilities as a DM, because yes, there is more that you have to do than just run the game. And this is another one of those that I completely understand. When you first start out, you may not know that this role requires you to do other things. Like what, you may ask? Well, let me tell you. For one thing, scheduling is usually handled by the DM, so it helps to have a good idea of everyone's availabilities and how best to work them together. Also, as the DM, you're often the person who people will turn to when they can't make it, and then you have to make the call as to whether or not to cancel. Real quick, my rule, if you want to know more about that, is that if one player misses one session, I keep going. If they miss a second session, I cancel, but if they'll be gone for a while, I'll keep going. The only reason why I cancel for a one-time absence is if 2 or more players cancel in that same session, but that's just me. As the DM, also, you're also often expected to be the voice of reason. If you have an unruly player, it is usually your job to call them out, and if it keeps happening, you're the one who has to talk with them and ultimately make the call to give them the boot if necessary. None of us are perfect, and we've all made mistakes. I've definitely had issues with players in the past that I could have handled differently, and no one expects you to be perfect, but now that you know this part of responsibilities as DM, you do have to at least try. And lastly, the same goes for things that you do as a DM. Make sure that you aren't making your players uncomfortable. Make sure you're not doing things that you wouldn't want to have in games with encounters that you make. Ask them what they're okay with seeing and doing ahead of time and accommodate for that. Don't ask questions, try and change your minds, just work with them. It's your job to help your players feel welcome and facilitate the game, not just run it. But your responsibilities aren't the only things you might refuse as a new DM. There's something else you might refuse to do as well. This game is all about improv, but some DMs just seem so inflexible sometimes. Some just refuse to improv anything and resort to anger when the littlest thing unexpected happens. Obviously, anger as a DM is never okay, but I get the impulse at least to minimize opportunities for you to improv during the game as a new DM. It's just like I said with my first point. It can be intimidating, and you might not have developed the skills and experience necessary to do this yet. Additionally, you may not even have realized that you're doing it. I won't spend a lot of time on this point because the remedy is pretty much the same as that mentioned in my first point, and it's planning, but how can you identify when you're doing it? If you find yourself putting up walls whenever your players do things you aren't ready for, blocking off certain paths and taking things away from them and taking away their agency, like I said in my first point, you're refusing to improv. But honestly, improv is tough. It's one of those skills that people spend entire lifetimes mastering, and the kind that you just have to kind of pick up with time. I challenge myself by leaving out little inconsequential things, not big plot things, but little physical descriptions and such, kind of blank. Obviously, this will differ for everyone. You might not be comfortable doing that, and what you're comfortable improving is up to you. You might be more comfortable improving more dialogue ideas, motivation, stuff like that, but I recommend against doing it with big plot stuff. That's generally a bad idea. Still plan. Ironically, I think planning is the key to improv, at least in games like this, but that whole leaving little things blank is just an exercise. However, you might also have players who are perfectly comfortable with improv and roleplay and that kind of thing, and if you do, that's great. Let them. And that's actually my next point. A new DM might interrupt a vital moment where your players are role-playing together and getting to know each other's characters. And again, like I've been saying this entire video, I completely get why new DMs might do this. As a new DM, you might think that your entire job is to run the game and tell a story, but as I already established earlier, this just simply isn't true. In order for your players to have fun, it's probably important to actually get them to be able to get into the game, and role-playing is a big part of that. As a DM, it's also your job to do your best to ensure player cohesion, and as you might have guessed, role-playing is a huge part of that as well. How can your players feel like they're part of a team if they never have a moment to talk to each other? You need to be giving your players ample time to do so. If you need any ideas, you can do this in between adventures, while traveling, during short rests, during long rests, during downtime, and really whenever your players want to, even in the heat of combat. If you have 2 players exchanging some important information or some clever, witty banter back and forth, let them. That's really cool. And if you find them trying to take a minute to get to know each other's characters, do not interrupt them. Keep quiet for a minute and let them talk. A lack of player cohesion is how you get situations where your players might say things like, I don't know these people, and for more info on that, I'll refer to my videos on how players can help their DMs out over the table. In fact, I have a whole playlist about this, so I'll try to link that in the description as well. And lastly here, if you give your players ample opportunities to roleplay and they just don't take them, and then issues with player cohesion come up, do what I said earlier and just bring this up with them outside of the game in a mature way later on. Interrupting and vetoing roleplay can be seen as controlling, and chances are your players won't like it, but my next and final point is all about another controlling behavior that new DMs might do, and this one's especially tricky because they might not even realize they're doing it. So what is it? Well, a lot of people might be attracted to DMing because they love to world build, and I agree, world building is fun, but DMing is more than that. You may want to make sure that you don't forget that you're telling a story. It may be tempting to do whatever you can to showcase your world, but if you're just dragging them around from place to place because you want to show off your bright and shiny new world, you're not running a game. What you're doing is you're playing history teacher, and while history is cool, I personally don't play D&D for history. I play it because it's a fun game that combines story and roleplay and creative problem solving, and quite frankly, I just think that's awesome. So don't take that away from your players. What I recommend for you for this is twofold and simple. The first part is this: just a little bit of patience can go a long way. Whatever you have planned can come up in its own time. Let it happen naturally. I can guarantee you that it will be much more fun that way, and it will also feel much more natural. And the more natural that it feels, the less your players will get pulled out of the game. And if it doesn't happen, because it might not, that's fine too. Remember, this game is a group effort, and what you and your players do together is probably better than what you have in your head. And that's the second part of my twofold advice here: humility. But that's it. As always, thank you all for watching, and I hope it helped. Be sure to check out this week's other video. It's a story about player creativity at its finest. Also, check back next week some advice on how I generate encounter ideas, and another story from the first campaign that I told stories from on this channel. It's the one with Thane and Amaros the Amorous, and I have a whole playlist just about that if you're curious or if you want to get caught up. And of course, until then, let's learn something.